who is Professor of International Relations and Gulf Studies at Georgetown. And he looked at the blockade from the perspective of foreign policy analysis. Then we have Dr. Hamad who is, if I get his title correct, is Assistant Dean for Community Engagement and Innovation and Assistant Professor for Global Studies at Hamad and Khalifa University. Then we have Dr. Jocelyn Sage Mitchell, who is an Assistant Professor in Residence at Northwestern University in Doha. And then we have Dr. Carrick Al-Ansari, who is an Assistant Professor in the College of Science and Engineering at Hamad and Khalifa University. And so George will start by looking at foreign policy analysis. Everyone will then come in and look at the issue of entrepreneurialism and how that has been impacted by the blockade. Jocelyn will look at the domestic policy opportunities of the blockade. And then Tarek will conclude by looking at food security, which is a hugely important and increasingly important issue. So please go to carry on.
Thank you. It's not working yet.
There you go.
Thank you. Yes, this is working. So I'm not claiming that this is the most important of the angles, that the 15 angles represented in the book, but it's an interesting angle, and it happens to be one of the things that I focus on, which is foreign policy analysis as a discipline, part of the wider international relations discipline, which of course what we teach, amongst other things, at Georgetown. So I'll just give you a quick flavor of some of the things that I thought this discipline could contribute to analyzing this current crisis, and at the same time to look at how this crisis might tell us a little bit about the discipline. So it's not just commentary on the blockade. It tries to be, as much of the book does, it tries to be part of a social science exercise. And just as a parenthesis, I was thinking, where else in the Gulf region could you actually undertake an exercise like this at the moment? And I couldn't really think of many, perhaps partially in Kuwait. So there are plenty of assumptions underlying a discipline like foreign policy analysis, and indeed international relations. There are different kinds of assumptions that inform different kinds of interpretations. So the most famous in international relations is realism, right, where it thinks of the world as an anarchic place, and the game between, the battle between, competition between states is one of dealing with this anarchy. And realists would say, it's all about power. States are bound to secure and perhaps increase their power in order to survive in this anarchical battle or competition. There are different versions of realism, but we don't need to go into that at this minute. Then there are others, like liberal institutionalists, who think that building institutions and interdependence is important. And then there are, to take just one more strand of thought, constructivists who say, well, actually, it's all very well to talk about material realities in the world out there, but they're not just givens. They only matter because of the way people interpret them. It's all socially constructed. The nature of that anarchical game is actually something that's socially constructed by the players amongst themselves. So that's the kind of broad background. And foreign policy analysis specifically delves down beyond, beneath the idea that it's all just a structured game. It's all just, all that matters is the structure of anarchical competition. In fact, most foreign policy analysis folk would say you've got to pay attention, yes, to the material factors at home and the material environment and the region and the world, but you also have to look at how these things are then interpreted by those who make decisions. And what's important there are decision-making structures, which sit in political systems, so you've got to have attention for that. And also the proclivities and the personalities, the characteristics of the leaders in question. There are different ways of interpreting all of that, but essentially it comes down to thinking in this overall structure that the realists talk about agency matters, as to say, the people making the decisions, the organizations making policy, are not simply helpless in this wider structure. They make a difference. One of the things that comes out of that is a recognition that often you can recognize a foreign policy role or a role conception on the part of a country or a leadership that is a longer term. There's certain features about how these leaders, how that country sees their position, its position in the world, what it is, what it should be, what their role should be. But the fact that those foreign policy roles are longer term doesn't mean that they are immutable. So, what does all of this mean for the Gulf states? First thing to note, in purely material factor, they're small apart from Saudi Arabia, and very vulnerable. So the vulnerability they've all got in common, they're also, of course, in a sense, attractive targets because of their resource wealth. So what do states like this do in this international game? They can, if the realists would say, well, they've got to try and build up their power. On the part of the smaller Gulf states, that might not seem a particularly viable option on its own. So there are other things that states do, according to international relations theorists. They have the choice, for instance, between balancing against the threats they see around them or bandwagoning with them. In the case of the Gulf states, the 6 Gulf states, the main threat, supposedly for some time, has been coming from Iran and Iraq, across different ideological periods. So the idea would be that these states are going to balance against such threats. How can they balance against them? Well, by looking to an outside hegemonic protector, right, a major great power. That's what they've all done. Now, in the case of Saudi Arabia, I'd say there's something else that comes into this. It's that foreign policy role conception. It's not just about calculation of their realist interests. It's also a sense of what Al Saud have always felt their role should be, and that's to be recognized as the major player on the Arabian Peninsula. That's always been part and parcel of their self-conception in foreign policy. So it's an ideational thing that comes alongside the realist calculation. What about the smaller 5 states? Well, again, so they have an additional threat, not just Iraq, Iran, for the 5 smaller Gulf states, and going back a century or more, one potential threat or active threat has always been the Al Saud. That's been managed, there's been fluctuations, but it's always been there. So how do they respond to that? Again, they've got a choice of balancing against, and then where do they look? They look for outside protection, or also gathering together, or they bandwagon with Saudi Arabia, as it became in 1932. All of them have kind of navigated between these 2 options, but clearly Bahrain has plumbed fully for bandwagoning with Saudi Arabia. It's become a dependency economically and strategically, whereas Qatar is perhaps the clearest example of balancing against the potential or actual Saudi threat by going full on for protection from, look at its security and protection from a great power. Initially, if you go back again a century, initially it was Great Britain, and then it becomes the United States. Now, in the case of Qatar, just like Saudi Arabia has this element of role conception that comes into foreign policy, so too, I think for Qatar, that's been the case, clearly visible since the mid-1990s. There was some idea of what Qatar was supposed to be, could be, both domestically and internationally, and that it becomes allied with this search for security. Now, we do see long-term patterns in all of the Gulf states' foreign policies. Let me just list 3. 1, there's always been tensions and clashes amongst them. That's nothing new. 2, a pragmatic, by and large, pragmatic way of dealing with these. And 3, maintaining, even amongst tensions and clashes, maintaining face-saving ways of climbing down or allowing the other party to climb down. That's been, again, I recognize this over at least 100 years of policy in these states. Now, the Qatar crisis is a break, in some respect, a break in these patterns. It's not that their realist concerns disappear. It's not that role conceptions disappear. But it is clearly that the way in which this boycott was imposed, going right for the highest possible level, short of military intervention, and the way in which face-saving avenues for climbing down, for allowing others to save face, were completely blown up. That, I think, is unprecedented. So we've got to look for an explanation. I'd say the key element is that, apart from longer-standing friction about Qatar's increasing status, the real element, the real explanation is that in Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi, the leaderships now in charge view plural voices or plural narratives about power and the Muslim Brotherhood as threats. And hence, Qatari policy, which is more tolerant of that kind of plurality, is also seen as a threat. So, given the way this is played out, to me it's perfectly obvious that the interpretation or the diagnosis of this issue on the part of the Saudi and Abu Dhabi leaderships was clearly flawed, to put it mildly. And so was the medicine applied. Again, it was flawed. Moreover, the considerations of the implications of applying that medicine clearly also hadn't been done, no due diligence had been done there. So how do you explain this? Because it's not typical for the kind of policy patterns we've seen over the past century. I'd say very briefly 5 things. 1, decision-making structures in Saudi Arabia and the UAE changed fundamentally. The kind of dispersed pool of thought and expertise and deliberation that featured, that characterized Saudi and UAE decision-making has gone. 2, that brought the personalities of the particular proclivities of the people in charge, MBS and MBZ, into far greater relief. 3, there is a material factor that the realists would look at involved as well, which is in particular that Abu Dhabi's and UAE's military capability has been built up to a much greater extent, so to begin to match some of their ambitions. 4, the evolving role conceptions that characterize the current leaderships in Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabia, therefore had a possibility to grow, to develop, and indeed to be executed. But the final factor, the 5th factor, that really enabled for this to take effect properly was a change in the environment, and the key change there was the advent of Donald Trump. So a quick few conclusions, and you can read the rest in the book. One is that states' foreign policy is of course in part related to their having to play the game in this anarchic environment, and so its relative size and power of states is important, but it's not the only thing that drives or defines policy. One is that the calculation of interests in this environment is done by individual leaders, and in this particular environment, these leaders are not constrained by the bureaucratic apparatus, the bureaucratic foreign policy apparatus one normally associates with foreign policy making. 3, the third point, is that policy is also in large measure shaped by role conceptions. So it kind of confirms something to feed back into the discipline of foreign policy analysis. Now, in some cases, let's look at Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabia. They match what some people in the realist school, namely particularly the offensive realism, would say states would do. That is to say, offensive realists say what states will typically do in this anarchic environment is to proactively attempt to increase their relative power in their regional environment. So arguably that is exactly what Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabia have been doing. And the final thing is that the realists don't have it all their own way. It's also the constructivists might have something to claim here, because clearly regional systems features are as much a function, I would say, of worldviews and perceptions amongst leaderships as they are of material facts. And I'll leave the rest for discussion.